So this presentation on psychedelics, sociality, and human evolution is an idea that I've been working on for a long time. I'm certainly not the first person to come up with this idea. It has a long, famous and infamous history, including Weston LaBarre and, of course, Terence McKenna. But they didn't have the information that we have today. And so what I want to be presenting to you today is some understandings that's really based on what clinical and psychedelic sciences have discovered in the last 10 to 15 years. I made my first effort at explaining the basic ideas that I'm going to present today in my book, Shamanism. But mostly it's been things that have developed since then. And most of the articles that I will be counting on today are there at researchgate.net. But most of what I have to say today really comes from just one article. And this is a co-authored article with Jose Rodriguez Arce on psychedelics, sociality, and human evolution, in which we bring together lots of different kinds of information to help us develop a better understanding of just how it is that psychedelics must have necessarily intersected with the human past. So my PowerPoint doesn't have references in it, but there's lots of them, about 5 or 6 pages worth in this paper, available both at Frontiers and on ResearchGate. The overall view of this talk today, I'm going to characterize as psychointegration. It's a term I've used for many years as an alternative for hallucinogens and psychedelics, and it reflects an understanding of how it is that psychedelics like psilocybin affect the overall dynamics of the brain. And what I have proposed, and which I will partially touch on here, is the idea that what these substances do is create an enhanced integration of the ancient cognitive processes of the brain, and in particular, liberation of the innate modules and their integration. So I'm going to begin with a very evolutionary perspective. How do we know that our hominin ancestors consumed psilocybin? Well, the same way that we know that they consume bananas, okay? Other primates do. Our closest cousins in the great apes do. And we'll look at a variety of ecological and behavioral patterns that lead us to conclude that we must have encountered and adapted to these very powerful substances in the environment millions of years ago. One of the important factors that encourage this adaptation has to do with the relationship between psilocybin and the serotonergic nervous system, the most important neuromodulatory system, which is also stimulated at a number of different types of receptor sites by psilocybin. But perhaps the most important early adaptation has to do with its enhancement of our adaptation to stress. And we'll look at some very specific serotonergic systems stimulated by psilocybin that give us an adaptive stress response rather than a passive one. The broad framework that we're going to use here for addressing these questions is what's called psychedelic instrumentalization. It's a takeoff from the broader concept of drug instrumentalization, which is the idea that we use drugs because they were helpful, not because that they were addictive or debilitating, but because they helped us adapt. They helped us, deal with stress. They kept us awake when we needed to be awake. They let us sleep. It's a well-established perspective in the evolutionary sciences. But for some curious reason, the people that propose drug instrumentalization in general don't even want to talk about psychedelic instrumentalization and don't even want to let us publish in the main journals. Somehow, psychedelic instrumentalization pushes the envelope too far. But we're going to make a very powerful argument, I think, that psychedelic instrumentalization was key to human evolution in a lot of different ways, but in particular through facilitating the development of the cognitive niche. The cognitive niche is the cultural model that we are able to develop because we have certain kinds of cognitive capabilities. And the cultural niche is considered to be the most important factor in human evolution. It was through creating shared models of how to adapt to the environment, get our food, that we were able to move beyond simple physical adaptations. And I'm going to point out that psilocybin has a number of social, emotional, and cognitive effects that are going to enhance the ability to participate in the cognitive niche. So the neurological perspectives are sort of this balance between what does the clinical data say and what do we know about what these substances do in the brain. It's going to start off with the idea that they enable us to integrate information in a normal but normally rare way, something that's analogous to dreams. Dreams being an important form of cognitive integration that occurs during the sleeping periods. The psychedelics mimic that state, as well as producing a variety of psychosocial effects, making us more open to others, less fearful, more likely to bond with other people, more extroverted, greater understanding of other people's intentions, as well as creating a variety of information dynamics. Now, what happens under psychedelics is disabling of the top-down brain control and an enabling of a bottom-up integrative mode of information transfer. It also creates a broad functional integration, long-distance integration across the brain. Of course, perhaps one of the most significant things that the psychedelics did was to stimulate the origins of a natural religion, shamanism. It's what a lot of what I've written about, but I'm only going to just touch on it briefly today, focusing on some of these other issues. So how do we know that our hominin ancestors consumed psychedelic mushrooms? Well, if we look at the great apes and other primates, they ingest medicinal plants. They even eat mushrooms. They use medicinal plants intentionally to treat problems like intestinal parasites, gastrointestinal problems. That fungi consumption and self-medication is widely documented among primates. So there's no reason to question that our hominid ancestors also did this. When did we start doing it? Probably at least 2.5 million years ago, when our exposure to psychedelic fungi intensified when we were present on the grasslands of Africa. And there in bovine feces, we would have encountered psilocybin mushrooms growing. And this is something that would have been a part of our adaptation, because first we were scavenging carcasses of bovines killed by carnivores, and later we were hunting them. And even after the movement out of Africa, psilocybin mushrooms are found in most ecozones of the world. Probably only the Arctic and Antarctic and subarctic regions don't have some psilocybin-containing mushrooms. So the widespread presence of psilocybin in the past in the environment of evolutionary adaptation assured that hominids would have encountered mushrooms and would have experimented with them. Indeed, one might argue that an adaptation to understanding edible mushrooms, toxic mushrooms, and psychedelic psilocybin mind-altering mushrooms had to be a very early adaptation and may even have some biological components to it. So psilocybin was a common element in the environment of evolutionary adaptation. And we know this today for a number of reasons. One being that there are a number of different genres with psilocybin. They're found almost in all ecozones. And this is not just a recent phenomenon. We know this because there are region-specific psilocybin-containing mushrooms that are still only found in certain regions of the world, implying a great antiquity and, of course, an adaptation to their specific ecozone. Of course, in addition to the psilocybin mushrooms, we have the Amanita species worldwide. Some of their biological mechanisms are distinctly different from psilocybin, acting on the GABAergic neurons, but the net effects on cognitive function, I think, is very much the same, just different mechanisms. Now, this encounter with these mushrooms worldwide happened long in the past, long before modern culture, civilizations. And we see this as attested to in petroglyphs all over the world, in Russia, Bronze Age in Europe, in Spain, where they've actually been able to identify the likely species based upon detailed features. In Africa and Algeria, a sketch here, another. Even in Egypt, it's been proposed that the Egypt crown was in fact modeled after the most potent of the mushrooms, the one right here before the cap opens up. I've recently done research in India, Khajuraho, the famous Kama Sutra temples, where we find on the thresholds of almost every temple in what is one of the most important temple sites in India, mushrooms. You have to step on the head of the mushroom, basically, to get into the sanctuary. Why Wasson missed these, I don't know, but Clearly, India has an entheogenic background. The Mayans had it, the famous mushroom stones. You find even Amanita ceramics from hundreds of years ago in Mesoamerica, Peruvian mushroom stones, mushroom artifacts around Argentina. Virtually all around the world, wherever you look, you're going to find an ancient past representations of mushrooms. This shows that this was important to religions. And indeed, it probably wasn't a significant factor in the evolution of shamanism from a baseline of hominid ritual practices. Can't talk about that much here today, but I've explored in these two articles, Psychedelics, the Shamanism and Psychedelics, where I've looked at an evolutionary paradigm for understanding why it is that we should consider psilocybin to have been a central factor in motivating this development. And basically because the effects of psilocybin and the nature of shamanic practice is very similar. Visionary experiences, soul flight, internal powers that you experience in the body, divination, animal relations, death and rebirth experiences, even altruistic behavior. We now know from double-blind clinical studies that psilocybin induces altruism, and it has a long-term effect. And we know from double-blind clinical studies that mystical and spiritual experiences can be provoked by psilocybin in controlled conditions. About 80% of the people score at their highest level in their entire life in terms of mystical experiences on their first psilocybin experience. So my other article here explores how this evolutionary interaction emerged between psychedelics and shamanism, with shamanism basically developing a ritual paradigm that enhanced the ability to incorporate these effects. Presence of entheogens in world religions, in India, in Judaism, in ancient Egypt, and ancient traditions of Europe, even in Christianity. There's a special issue of Journal of Psychedelic Studies, 2019, on psychedelics and history and world religion. They are everywhere in our past. The question is, how do we incorporate that understanding into how we now review our past? I'm going to suggest that the implications of this transcultural phenomenon, the worldwide presence of psilocybin mushrooms, indicates we need to have a biological perspective. We need to view the entheogenic experience as a biological universal. Human cultures everywhere encounter these substances, use them, had mystical and spiritual experiences, and figured out how to incorporate these into their culture, into their religions, into their spiritual practice and shamanic activities. And this idea of psychointegration that I want to present here is basically the notion that the effects of psilocybin stimulated both serotonergic and dopaminergic systems, and the net effect was to invoke a bottom-up dynamic in the brain that integrated our unconscious brain mechanisms into our consciousness. So we have evidence of the effects of drugs on human evolution, beginning with special enzymes that we have in metabolic processes that take what are normally considered to be plant toxins designed to deter consumption and turn them into neurotransmitters. That in essence, the ability to consume and metabolize these substances gave us an enhanced performance on a variety of goal-directed behaviors that enabled us to have more energy, more endurance, to resist pain, or to relax or be more sociable when necessary. So this idea that there was positive effects on adaptation through the utilization of psychedelics has led to this, or utilization of drugs in general, has led to this drug instrumentalization theory that says that drug use was functional. It was not an addictive breakdown in our defensive mechanisms. Rather, it was doing something that was adaptive and enabled us to more effectively function in the physical and the social environments in which we found ourselves. So the psychedelic instrumentalization is our novel approach here. And the idea is that psychedelics went far beyond the stimulants and the pain numbers to enhance performance on a variety of fitness relevant behaviors. That in fact, they enhanced our ability to participate in a cognitive niche, to imagine cognitive niches, to create new cognitive niches. And in contrast to some claims about psychedelics being dangerous, toxic substances that had to be avoided. What we know, in fact, is that psilocybin is far less toxic than most of the pharmaceuticals being prescribed by doctors. Its therapeutic index is in the 600s. Its toxicity is virtually negligible. You'd have to eat like 16 kilos of most psilocybin mushrooms to get anywhere near a toxic dose. Rather than being a toxin, it had to be considered something that increased our fitness because ingesting these plants enabled us to utilize their compounds, which resemble our endogenous neurotransmitters. And so that there are a number of different adaptive results of using these substances that enhanced our capacities to do a variety of social and cognitive behaviors. How do they act on the brain? Well, they act first on the serotonin pathways. Psilocybin is an agonist. It stimulates the serotonin receptors. Serotonin is key to higher cognitive processes, and significantly, it regulates the triune brain. Basically, it's a repressive mechanism. It keeps the emotional and behavioral aspects of the brain repressed so that the cognitive ones can have full reign. But psilocybin and other 5-HT2 psychedelics also have secondary effects. Eventually, they block out the serotonin sites because they're not as susceptible to reuptake. And so the serotonin system eventually gets blocked out. Its repressive mechanisms are freed, and it liberates the dopaminergic brain, which is then projecting all of its activity into the frontal cortex. And a system that evolved in mammals for bonding and attachment underwent a variety of evolutionary developments in the hominid line, including an enhanced ability to integrate groups, for instance, through singing and dancing and chanting, which stimulate the endorphins. And in essence, it liberated the lower aspects of the brain, this triune brain, the reptilian brain, the paleomammalian brain, and it enabled these ancient psychological, emotional, and cognitive processes to be brought up into consciousness. It's a bottom-up dynamic, which replaces the normal top-down control by the brain. It also enhances what Fred Previck has called extrapersonal cognition. It enhances our ability to think about things away from our physical body, things distant in space and time. Perhaps the most significant first adaptation provided by the use of psilocybin had to do with stress adaptation. Humans have two serotonin-mediated responses to stress and adversity. One that's mediated by the 5-HT1A receptor, and it's the default signaling system that basically enables a passive coping strategy. You endure, you tolerate stress, you just put up with what's bothering you. But we also have a 5-HT2A receptor signaling system that's an active coping strategy. It enables us to respond to stress by changing stressful circumstances or our relationship to them. And psilocybin and other serotonergic psychedelics preferentially engage the 5-HT2A receptor signaling system. And by stimulating this system, which evolved to mediate rapid and deep learning when faced with environmental crises and other stressful conditions, it increased our ability to adapt through changing how it is that we related to the problems that we encountered. So what we know from laboratory studies is that psilocybin stimulates a variety of responses of the 5-HT2A receptor signaling system. It elevates cortical neuroplasticity and enabling us to develop new kinds of connections. It enhances our associative learning. It reduces stress and anxiety. It enhances patience, and it increases neuroplasticity, which enables us to rewire our brains to adapt in new ways, and it enhances both creativity and sociality. So what I think was the next major effect in terms of psychedelic instrumentalization was its enhancement of a unique hominin capacity. the socio-cognitive niche or cultural niche, which is to say the socially shared mental constructions that enable us to pass on information from person to person, generation to generation. In the case of human beings, this socio-cognitive niche or cultural niche is considered to be the most important factor in hominin evolution, basically being able to share information from generation to generation. And what was required for this kind of development was the ability to share information, to share models. And what we see as the uniquely human capacities for cognition, sociality, communication, and learning are all enhanced by psilocybin. So the psychedelic instrumentalization hypothesis is that by taking psilocybin, we enhanced our capacities for complex social interaction, to engage with others without fear, to feel more connected to others, and to create larger social groups that could tolerate each other. So the adaptive benefits should be understood in a Baldwinian evolutionary model in the sense that psilocybin stimulated certain kinds of capacities. And those kinds of capacities then were instrumentalized in cultural niche construction. And consequently, those of our ancestors who had the best pre-existing neural and genetic structures for utilizing these substances were the most successful in entering into the cognitive niche, sharing cultural models, and learning from others in those cultural models. And so by that kind of environmental influence, the hominin ancestors were selected for those who could most effectively utilize the psilocybin effects. For managing psychological distress, for treating health problems, for enhancing social interaction, for creating better interpersonal relations, for enhancing our cognitive processes, for engaging in collective decision making, for being able to see things in a new and different way, and of course, the facilitation of collective ritual and religious activities. That must also be considered one of the most significant effects that psilocybin had in creating a new way of relating to the world, using rituals to heal, integrate communities, and to address social problems. So I would like to present the overall dynamic of psychointegration as being one in which the normal dynamic of top-down control is replaced. One of the things that psilocybin does in the brain is disable the prefrontal cortex, which links the frontal cortex with the lower brain, and disables the default mode network, which keeps our habitual, emotional, personal, social reference, personal history dynamics together. And now what we normally have is our personal history and our personal reference and our sense of self and social relations doesn't fit together. In fact, what often happens in these conditions is the ego loss experience. We no longer have this sense of being our normal self. And what we get instead is this amplification of activity from the lower parts of the brain. The reptilian brain and the limbic areas of the brain are now able to send all their information up. So the basal brain areas are engaged in a serotonin mediated theta wave synchronization of not only the lower brains, but it eventually projects up the neuraxis and synchronizes the frontal cortex. So we're getting a basal, limbic, frontal synchronization, and even a right hemisphere, left hemisphere synchronization. In essence, an integration of the whole brain rather than just a top-down dynamic. And this synchronization of the frontal cortex with this lower brain dynamic means that we're getting the integration of our behavioral and emotional and unconscious dynamics, as well as what can be called paleomentation and emotiomentation. All of this is getting pushed up into the frontal cortex, the big drive. And there, all this information is getting integrated into what is an intrinsic and holistic state of psychological integration of unconscious and conscious dynamics. One of the significant ways in which this is manifested is through the effects of the psilocybin in terms of creating a visual kind of experience. What I would suggest is that hallucinations were the first symbols. It's like, what is that? What does that mean? We're getting information provided for us in a way that reflects the overall increased responsiveness of the brain to all kinds of stimuli. If you have your eyes open, you get the sensory stimuli and multisensory processing exemplified in synesthesia. But when you close your eyes, then now what you're getting is an enhanced input of information from within the brain. And psychedelics expand the activity in the visual cortex. It not only enhances visual cortex activity, but it enhances the connection, the functional connectivity of the visual cortex with the other association areas of the brain. But I think what we have to understand is that this primary process thinking of psychedelics is really a form of thought, and it's a form of thought that existed for millions of years before we had language. It's a form of thought that's found in our ape cousins, and that this really is a form of symbolic representation that is a natural part of the brain that is part of everyday life, and it's how we function in everyday life. But this presentational symbolism gets particularly stimulated under certain conditions. For instance, it's the representational system that underlies dreams. Notably, dreams are largely visual and not verbal. They reflect this ability of the brain to represent for itself important information that then is integrated. That's the function of it in dreaming, is the integration of information through the visual modality. And so this mode of visualization, which existed long before language, was what enhanced the capacity for the cognitive niche capabilities that permitted cultural niche constructions. And not only does any cultural niche constructions, creative and novel ones. Was psilocybin part of the expansion of the visual cortex in human evolution? Come up with a better reason why we needed to have better visual processing than the great apes. They have very good visual processing. We do it even better, hardwired in our brain. It was an intrinsic cognitive process that was part of the mechanisms used in dreaming and understanding everyday life that then were integrated and even enhanced through the psychedelic stimulation. Indeed, we ought to consider psychedelics as a perfect tool for understanding the system that emerges in fantasy and daydreaming and nighttime dreaming and mystical visions, a system that existed long before language and provided an image-based cognitive modality that enabled us to think, manipulate images, a metacognitive system for enhancing our ability to handle information. We know that from clinical research that psilocybin enhances a variety of different kinds of social behaviors. It makes us more sociable, reducing startle responses, reducing recognition of sad faces, reducing fearful reactions, and it reduces the sense that we're being socially excluded. On the other hand, it enhances emotional self-control and tolerance and stimulates pro-social attitudes and social connectedness. The research done by Griffiths and others at Johns Hopkins shows that single dose of psilocybin has a pro-social altruistic effect that persists for more than a year and confirmed by third-party observers. So we became more pro-social under the effects of psilocybin. We see this in studies that look at psychological measurements of extroversion and openness, which are enhanced, and the reduction of neuroticism. So the experiences that psychedelics induced made us more altruistic beings, very powerful. It also enhanced our intrapersonal and interpersonal intelligence, the ability to perceive what others are thinking. The notion of telepathy is widespread in psychedelic experiences, whether or not it's truly telepathy or just we think we understand people better, the experience is there. And it enables us to better understand what other people are thinking about us, to introject other people's perspectives. So our interpersonal and interpersonal intelligences are being enhanced by these substances, and our ability to relate to others socially are also being enhanced. It enhances euphoria, laughter, grinning, giddiness, playfulness, exuberance. It enhances cohesion of groups. It strengthens social bonds among people, and it gives people an increased sense of connectivity with others, all of which would have supported participation in the cognitive and cultural niche. It also enhanced various forms of cognition, this psycho-integration. And the major researchers in psychedelics have part of this picture right, but I think they only got the first part. They talk about the lack of structure, the lack of coherence, the loss of priors, the loss of habitual perceptual and conceptual categorization. But what they miss is that it's not just an anarchic brain, as some have argued, it's an archaic brain. It's a brain that functions with its ancient cognitive capabilities rather than with the modern language-based ego-centered one. Clinical findings also show that there's a variety of improvements in cognitive representations, novel mental representations, enhanced mental imagery, greater cognitive flexibility, including the creation of unconventional associations and not normal conceptual linkages. A widely recognized effect of the psychedelics is their meaning-enhancing effects. It gives us a sense of things being more real than real, more meaningful than normal, more important than normal perceptions. And there's evidence that it enhances insightfulness and self-awareness. Also, clinical research showing heightened creativity, more curiosity, greater imagination, insight, perspective change, and an improved ability for creative problem solving, all of which is directly related to creating cultural niches. We also have the effects of psilocybin in creating enhanced brain connectivity. I guess you know which one is the psilocybin model. What happens under psilocybin is that not only do we lose the priors, the top-down determination, we lose this prefrontal cortex's determination of what's most important and shift to lower level integration of information with the frontal cortex, the enhanced integration of the visual cortex with all the association areas, and an augmented communication across the whole brain. We have a greater connectivity, a greater total functional connectivity in the brain than is normal, and a reduction of what are normally separate and non-connected networks. So we have a state of global brain coordination and synchronization with a greater variety of connectivity states. So that is why I say it's not an archaic brain. I mean, it's not an anarchic brain, it's an archaic brain. The parts of the brain that normally don't connect together are all being brought together in connection. And this is another reason why the concept of psycho-integration, I think, is so appropriate here. Also, a variety of ways in which our learning abilities are enhanced, the relaxation of prior assumptions and beliefs, suspension of habitual networks created by the prefrontal cortex and the default mode network, allow us to have different perceptions, new ways of thinking. And this enhanced capacity is part of the physiological effects in terms of enhancing neuroplasticity in the brain, neurogenesis to creation of new neural networks, enhanced learning, extinction learning, which may have been one of the important effects of the psychedelics. You break your old cultural niche model to learn a new one when the old model isn't working anymore. Why? Because you have enhanced cognitive flexibility, enhanced sensitivity to the environment, and overall, what the psychedelics that act upon serotonin do is promote structural and functional plasticity in the brain, an ability to create new adaptations because the brain itself is creating new connections. It may in part be due to the impediment of reuptake that psychedelics have in the serotonin system, forcing the brain to find new pathways to transmit the information. I think an overall dynamic of psilocybin and the 5-HT2 psychedelics has to be understood in terms of the disinhibition of the innate modules. What research by people such as Franz Vollenweider and Katrin Preller has shown is that a major dynamic of the brain on psychedelics is this cortical, striatal, thalamic cortical loops. These loops that go from the bottom of the brain up to the frontal cortex and back down, these are being liberated. And what's being freed is all these lower brain systems. When we look at the effects of psilocybin experientially, phenomenologically, to me, they all map onto what Gardner argued were innate intelligences or innate cognitive operators. Innate capacities acquired in the course of evolution because they were adaptive, such as animacy detection, as well as the ability to infer the thoughts of others, the so-called mind reading, as well as the ability to internalize the social models of others as our own models, the internalization that occurs in socialization. We also have an enhanced ability for understanding animals and animal behavior and innate capacity. We're able to engage in a variety of mimetic behaviors that are also innate operators, song and dance and chanting and imitation. And I think the most important one, although Gardner didn't focus on this, is this visual spatial intelligence, the ability to see things and put pieces together in a visual format. So these effects of psychedelics on the innate modules were including things such as producing this idea of a living universe. Nature has self properties, human cognitive properties, creating spirits. There are other selves out there that we don't see, but they have thoughts and expectations for us. The incorporation of animals as self or as social other, as in animal powers or in totemism. The out-of-body experiences being a special capability to disarticulate some of the normally integrated innate modules, and of course the whole realm of supernatural thought. When Gardner revised his innate thought processes in the year 2000, he added two others. One was a metaphysical intelligence and the other was a spiritual intelligence. He recognized these were innate human capacities. So what are the overall dynamics here? Well, sensory enhancement and connectedness, enhanced access to normally unconscious information. In essence, getting better access to pre-verbal cognitive functions, a psycho-integration of behavioral, emotional, and cognitive information, a cognitive expansion where synesthesia was probably the first form of symbolic thought long before we ever were able to speak in any symbolic kind of way, and an overall enhanced connectivity of the whole brain with the novel integration of brain networks. So the adaptive effects would include amplification of sensory acuity, so it could have made us better hunters and gatherers, and a better sense of connection with the environment that brought in this visual representation system and enhanced our pro-social tendencies to share those visual representations. It gave us improved cognition, better learning, ability to modify learned behaviors that were interrupted by the psychedelics. It also stimulated intrinsic healing processes. Now we have a wide variety of contemporary clinical literature that shows psilocybin has a variety of important healing effects. And of course, it stimulated the development of shamanism, cosmology, healing, dramatic enactments, and various forms of symbolism. So from an evolutionary perspective, what we have in the context of psychedelics is a recognition that these plants have a long-term evolutionary relationship with humans. We evolved enzymatic systems to utilize these things that are considered plant toxins. They produce spiritual states of consciousness that linked us to others and linked us to understandings that were part of our unconsciousness. They integrated important aspects of our brain and amplified our capacities for consciousness by the integration of what were normally unconscious processes, enhanced our capacity for introspection, and so created the foundation for shamanism and ritual cure in ways that still have important implications for humans today. So the facts are there in psychedelic sociality and human evolution. I think that we provided what I would consider to be a very convincing argument about why it is that psychedelics were part of human evolution. Someone might ask, can you prove that? You know, can you prove the stone ape theory? Science doesn't prove things. Science falsifies things. And I have a very simple falsification. My hypothesis is the major differences between the human brain and the chimpanzee brain have to do with the areas of the brain stimulated by psilocybin. this would be a way of establishing that through a Baldwinian effect, psilocybin, exercise, and environmental influence, selecting for those aspects of human genetics and cognitive and social and emotional capability that made us more capable of participating in the cultural niche. Thank you.